doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
I'm going to come to you, Martin, because the way you're working on it, very impressive. I haven't heard anyone not be thoroughly intrigued by why haven't we been doing this before, and why not Africa, and Africa's got such a huge competitive advantage and potential. Just tell us about your project, within the SMI Africa Council. Very interesting project indeed. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, to give this a place on this panel where we are discussing how on earth to get more allocations towards green assets in Africa, let's sort of change our mindset a little bit and turn it around. And there's a very helpful document to that's the Nairobi Declaration, which last year, in 2023, was signed by many heads of state. And if you read it, it's in fact, it's quite inspirational literature, because it talks about what this continent has to give to us in terms of opportunities, also increasingly investable opportunities. And I think, and then it was all summarized in a moment which sort of also showed how powerful that reframing can be when William Ruto then actually took the microphone and said, look, all the assets are on the balance sheet. Africa has the carbon sinks, Africa has biodiversity, but it's not on our balance sheet. If it was on our balance sheet, the world would see how rich we are. So that was also, in terms of reframing this conversation, a very interesting moment. And I think there is a very robust science to support that, that this is, of course, very relevant globally. We do know that a third of biodiversity sits in Africa. We do know that much of the climate regulation and of the hydrological regulation, I mean, if we cut down the trees in Gabon, which is not a theoretical, which is very much a political choice that needs to be made by political leaders now, how to do land use decisions in this time and age. Actually, we will feel the ripples of that, the effects, all the way towards the global north. So it's not Africa's problem, it's our problem, but also locally. It's very hard to describe a continent that actually has productive systems if we see that nature capital not being preserved. I mean, just the last 1.5 days of myself talking to large food brands that actually say that the complete failure of cocoa or coffee crop from Africa is a realistic choice now, unless we reinvest into that type of infrastructure, soils. Talking to last night for dinner, talking to a pharmaceutical CEO, where she says, let's be fair, 25 to 50% of our pharmaceutical formulations actually are somehow traced back to some of these very rich biodiversity reserves. Or talk about the mining industry, how for them it's a very, very critical question of will we have a license to go after these functional metals or not, and how do we have to behave towards the nature capital around it. So increasingly we can make a case that this, yes, holds asset value because it's a source of future benefits. And still we currently sit sort of very much tight-lipped without any proper financial instruments actually to tap this opportunity. We have a couple of instruments which are very which are part of the old world. Sort of, don't get me wrong, sort of we do have things like that for nature swaps, which are very good, but they're very slow. We do have things like philanthropy, which is very good, but it's very small. We have things like voluntary carbon markets, which are very good, but they have been created for a completely different purpose. So they have not been created to crowd in significant institutional capital to keep a whole new infrastructure type nature safe. And then we have compliance markets such as Article 6, which are very good, but they're not here yet, and no one knows when they will arrive on this planet. Now, and so so we somehow sit between a world where on the one hand we actually see that this is economically more and more important, on the other hand sort of we don't really have a way to invest. But I think within these two there is a very interesting gray zone emerging that is much more nuanced than us saying, look, look, it's hard actually to look at this as an investable asset class. There's a couple of things happening technologically, legally, financially, politically, economically. The first one I talked about a moment ago, and that's very much sort of how also we come into this conversation. For the first time, we have a mix of Earth observation technologies, in situ technologies, genetic technologies, and AI that really helps us to understand and describe these stocks of nature that exist. So in a way, that fiduciary grade decision making can actually depend on these outcomes. The second one, which is changing, is financially or legally, sort of the ability to actually create outcome-based contracts between the providers and the buyers. In a way that is much more scalable. I mean, just imagine a world where everyone who is making a land use decision, and these are millions and billions, actually could be very easily contracted and start to be rewarded for these outcomes. The third one is financially. Once we have these outcome contracts, then you can do things that currently we haven't really done. We can create a whole instrument or a whole inventory of different outcome-based financial instruments that are actually every time indexed on natural capital. So this starts with just intangible assets that sort of companies, we work with many food companies, where we have currently something like 1.5 million hectares under management in Africa. Many of them is food companies. They can actually take this onto their balance sheet as an intangible. That wasn't possible before. That's not just a technicality, that's almost a philosophical moment, the moment when money put into nature turns into part of our assets, part of our wealth, part of our future. Then we see things like outcome-linked loans, outcome-linked bonds. Then we see things like landscape funds, or we see things like nature asset companies. Every single time it's the attempt actually to turn nature outcomes into instruments. So we for the first time we have instruments to play with, and so we can move on to the question, why on earth would we actually, where are the incentives coming from to invest? And here again, if you look at large corporates, for the first time they actually realized how big their exposure to a healthy ecosystem increasingly is. So they are investing into insetting activities. We see a significant movement in 2024 has been quite remarkable when it comes to that there's a reassessment of what true and fair accounting really looks like. So are our accounts really reflecting the impacts and the dependencies we have? And so we think we are already on a journey, but now the real issue is how to bring off-takers into the conversation, which is very for our conversation with SMI here.
Okay, just can you give us that 30-minute snapshot of the
30-minute, are you sure?
Or 30-second even, yes. Yes. I'd enjoy it. But can you give us that 30-second snapshot of the nature on African government's balance sheet? Because you have ministers here, very engaged and interested in these types of subjects. What can they take back and say, that's an initiative that potentially could work in my country?
So we have three or four.
Just the one. Yes.
So I think essentially we can see evidence in countries that are able to do nature capital accounting and to show what kind of value actually sits in certain projects to get that to translate that into better borrowing terms that they have with sovereign lenders, and we have evidence of countries that actually have been able to turn this also into corporate private lending agreements. We have one project in Kenya where sort of basically the entire future benefits that actually sit in this project, this is a landscape restoration project, has been translated into something like 50 basis points improvement, and that wouldn't have been possible if you weren't able to actually demonstrate the concrete outcomes that are delivered year by year in terms of biodiversity, in terms of water, in terms of carbon outcomes.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much. That's very, very clear.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.